our new book is Soldier's Heart. It is the story of the enlistment and service of the boy Charlie Goddard. It was written by Gary Paulsen. Some of you may recognize this author as the author of Brian's Winter and The Hatchet and other adventure series books. Most of his characters are fictional, but this one happens to be about a true character in history. While he takes liberties to, not everything in here is exactly the way it would have been. He uses some of his ability to, as an author, make things up. It is a true story about a real person in history. This book has a foreword to it, and it's really important that we read this foreword. Most forewords you should read, but this really is going to explain to us kind of this underlying theme of PTSD. And for those of you that are familiar with that, that is, of course, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it happens when people have experienced trauma in their lives. This could be major trauma, like a war and watching people die right in front of you. It could be minor trauma where it could be where somebody is verbally abusive to you. I mean, those are all levels. There's levels to trauma, but people still experience PTSD at all levels of trauma. And this foreword explains to us that this really wasn't a diagnosis up until recently, and it kind of explains what people treated it as in the past. And Soldier's Heart is going to be a major theme because that's what they called PTSD during the Civil War time period. So I'm going to read the foreword, and then I'm going to jump right into chapter 1. War is always, in all ways, appalling. Lives are stopped in their youth, worlds are ended, and even for those who survive, and the vast majority of soldiers who go to war do survive, the mental damage done is often permanent. What they have seen and are forced to do is frequently so horrific and devastating that it simply cannot be tolerated by the human psyche. Now there is an attempt to understand this form of injury and deal with it. It is called post-traumatic stress disorder by those who try to cure it. They give it a technical name in the attempt to make something almost incomprehensible understandable, in the hope that by doing this, they will make it curable. But in other times and in other wars, they used more descriptive terms. In the Second World War, the mental damage was called battle fatigue. So when soldiers returned from World War II and they were dealing with PTSD, they called it battle fatigue. There were rudimentary efforts to help these victims. These usually involved lots of bed rest and the use of sedatives or other drugs. Sedatives are like sleeping drugs, kind of knock you out. In the First World War, it was called shell shock. People really oftentimes, this is more a common term that people will say. They'll say like, oh, he was really shell shocked. Kind of this idea that he's in like trauma from what the person has experienced. We actually use that now as a metaphor for kind of people that are kind of acting very shocked about something or acting stunned by it. It was named based on the damage done by the overwhelming use, for the first time in modern war, of artillery fire against soldiers in stationary positions. They would, in World War I, they were in trenches, right? And so inside these trenches, they would shoot the cannons and well, it wouldn't have been cannons at the time. It would have been like grenades and bombs shooting, and the sound of it just over time, over and over on these men that just stayed hunkered down in those trenches would leave many of them deaf and some of them dazed, kind of in like this vegetative state. The concussions of exploding incoming rounds, thousands upon thousands of them, often left men deaf and dazed, many of them with a symptom called the 1,000-yard stare. So they would just kind of, afterwards it would be like, hey, how are you doing? And there's like this 1,000-yard stare that was occurring. The afflicted were essentially not helped at all and simply sent home to their families to care for them. Most were irrational, meaning they don't really make sense. They kind of had lost their minds. Many were in a vegetative state. Vegetative meaning they can't even care for themselves. They don't even take care of themselves. In the Civil War, the syndrome was generally not recognized at all. While the same horrors existed as those in modern wars, in some ways they were even worse, because the technological aspect of war being born then, the wholesale killing by men using raw firepower, was new I'm totally misunderstood. The same young men were fed into the madness. But in those days, there was no scientific knowledge of mental disorders, and no effort was made to help the men who were damaged. Some men came through combat unscathed. Most did not. These men were somehow different than the other men. They were told to have had soldier's heart. And that's the name of our book today, and what they called kind of PTSD during the Civil War. Chapter 1, June 1861. Remember, April of 1861 is when the attack on Fort Sumter happens, and so we are just a couple months later, the first beginning parts of the Civil War. He heard it all, Charlie did. Heard the drums and the songs and the slogans and knew what everybody and his rooster was crowing about. There was gonna be a shooting war. They were having town meetings and nailing up posters all over Minnesota. And the excitement was so high, Charlie had seen girls faint at the meetings. Just faint from all the noise and the hullabaloo. It was better than a circus, or what he thought a circus might be like. He'd never been to one. He'd never seen anything but Winona, Minnesota, and the river 5 miles each way from town. There was going to be a shooting war. There were rebels who'd violated the law. They'd fired on Fort Sumter, and the only thing they'd respect was steel, it was said. He knew they were right. The Union was right. And one other thing they said as well, if a man didn't hurry up, he'd miss the whole thing. The only shooting war to come in a man's life, and if a man didn't step right along, he'd miss it. Charlie didn't figure to miss it. The only problem was, Charlie wasn't rightly a man yet. Well, at least not to the Army. He was 14, and while he worked as a man, worked in the fields all day and all night, he looked like a man, standing tall and just a bit thin with hands so big they covered a stove lid. He didn't make a beard yet, and his voice had only just dropped enough so he could talk like a man. If they knew, he thought, if they knew he was only 14, they wouldn't take him at all. But Charlie watched, and Charlie listened, and Charlie learned. Minnesota was forming a volunteer regiment to go off and fight. It would have near on 1,000 men when it was full. Men from Winona, Taylor Falls, Matoka, and as far north as Deerwood, and from the capital of St. Paul as well. 1,000 men. Charlie learned one thing about an army. One part of an army didn't always know the business of another part of the army. The 1,000 men in the regiment would be in companies of 80 to 100 men from each section, and it'd be hard for a man to know men who weren't from the same area. Charlie couldn't join where they knew him. Somebody'd spill the beans and he'd get sent back or used as a runner or a drummer boy. He wasn't anyone's boy. He was going to sign to fight as a man, and he knew a way of doing it. They'd gather together at Fort Snelling up along the Mississippi River. All the companies from all over the town would assemble there before they went off to fight. He'd just take him a walk, Charlie would. Take a walk by himself until he was at Fort Snelling, and there he'd lie about his age, sign up as a man, and get himself a musket and a uniform to go see what this war was like. "I won't get into any trouble, Ma," he said, wrapping some bread and cold potatoes and half a roast chicken into a piece of cotton. "Plus, they'll be paying me. I hear they give $11 a month. I'll send most of it on home to you and Orrin." Orrin was his younger brother. "You can use the money, and I won't be under your feet all the time." "You aren't under my feet." She hated it when he talked fast. He always got his way when he talked fast. He'd smile, and that cowlick would stand up in the back of his head, and he'd talk fast, and she just couldn't keep from him what he wanted. He was a good boy, as good as they came, but ever since his father Paul had been kicked to death by a horse gone mad when a swarm of bees had landed on it, Charlie only had to smile, talk a little fast, and he usually got his way. You've never been under my feet." "Same as," he said, shaking his head. "I'm always in the way. Best I go off and see what the big fuss is all about." "You ain't but a boy. Gotta be a man sometime. You've said it more than once yourself, Charlie. You've said, you gotta be a man. Well, here it is, my chance to be a man. A boy wouldn't go off to earn $11 a month and wear a uniform. Only a man would. So I'm going to be a man and do what a man can do." And he won. She knew he would, and he did, and he took his bread and his cold potatoes and chickens and left home walking down the road to Fort Snelling. And if she'd known what was to come of it, if she had known and could have told him what would come of it, she would have fought to drag him back and let the federal government keep all their $11 a month. But she'd also heard the songs. She'd seen the slogans and the parades. She'd been to the meetings and thought it was her son Charlie leaving. And though it was her son Charlie leaving, she did not think it would be so bad. Nobody thought it would be so bad. Nobody thought it could be so bad. All the officers and the politicians and the newspapers said it'd be a month or two. No longer. It'd all be over by the fall. Well, we know that's not true, right? And the author does a good job of kind of foretelling, foreshadowing what is to come. It's going to be very bad for Charlie. This was the mentality, though. Still is the mentality when people find out about wars, okay? Especially young boys and young men. Today, you definitely couldn't get into the Army if you were that age. But even at 18, 19, 20 years old, people have this idea, this romantic idea about the military, right? They have this romantic idea that the war is starting and I'm going to do my part and I'm going to fight in it. And there's definitely like this heroism and this goal and there's this duty, and it's beautiful because people are called to fight for what's right. People are called to fight for their country, to fight for freedoms, to fight for these things. And it's beautiful. And I believe it's godly courage that has given the ability for many people to fight for the rights and the beliefs that we have today. But there is a naivety that goes along with that godly courage that really says, I'm invincible. Okay, teenagers still have this feeling. They might not be going off to war, but this idea that, this can't touch me. I'm pretty invincible. They drive fast. They try drugs. They think that everything in the world is out there to try and to experiment with. And everyone has this tiny bit of that rebel in them and their human nature that just says, okay, that happened to you and it was bad for you, but it's not going to happen to me. Okay. And so we see that at the start of the Civil War where people were just like, okay, people die in wars and wars are terrible and all this. My grandpa told me all about that, but I'm going to experience it myself. I'm going to go and I'm going to do this. And thousands of volunteers will sign up for something they really don't understand that they're signing up for. Now, I'm not calling them wrong for signing up. I think it takes valiant courage. I think it takes incredible bravery. And it took men and women throughout the generations to be able to fight for what we have today. But I definitely think there is a sect, there is a group of people whenever wars or whenever big kind of risky things happen that say, it's not going to be my story. It's not the way it's going to go for me. And they find out usually that it is. So Charlie, off to war, the Civil War, June of 1861.